I'll hand over to Jade, and thank you very much for setting us off.
Oh, kia ora koutou, and thank you, Becky, for your mahi and karakia to start us off in the right way. And thank you, Sophie, for the introduction, but also like the very flattering description of me. That was quite nice. So thank you for that. And it's really lovely to be here with you all and share space in this way. And still, I didn't do that many teleconferences over lockdown, and I still find it a bit jarring compared to being face to face, but it does mean that we can cross that barrier of being in different locations and without the big carbon footprint and all of that kind of thing. So I'm pretty supportive of this mode where maybe half of our hui and meetings can be held in this way and the other half retain that face-to-face connection. So yeah, I still find it strange, but I'm grateful for it at the same time, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share screen and hope that this works. Oh, good. This is looking promising. Okay, right.
Jay, just before, do you want me to give you a kind of nod in terms of time, or you want to keep your own time?
I think I can see it on my screen. If I'm just going to try and go into full screen. You would think I would learn how to use PowerPoint, but I still don't know how to make it the full size.
There you go.
No, is that good enough? No, that's not quite right. Hang on. How do
that little symbol at the bottom? You know, where there's the plus and minus. Does that work?
Hello. Yes. I'm very sorry for that. Okay. And actually, now I do want you to keep time because I can't see my clock anymore.
Just to give people an idea, the idea is 15 minutes of talking and then 5 minutes for chatting, and then we'll have a longer korero at the end.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, all right, I'll start properly now. So what I really wanted to share was just some of the thoughts and reflections I had from our experiences with coronavirus, COVID-19, the lockdown that we went through. And for me, the key takeaway was really that it sharply drew into contrast the where the power lies and who holds power. And I think you could cut that a number of ways, but the big one for me was really just the difference between the power held by the crown, which are deemed sovereign, versus our hapū. And it was, I guess we all know that the government has a hell of a lot of power, but rarely we see it enacted in such a way. And now that we're past the very imminent public health crisis, I actually think it's a really good time to be thinking and talking about this, because when it's all happening, I think a lot of people felt, well, this is consuming, but we also would like the public health aspect to be dealt with appropriately. And it's probably not the right time to be criticizing government or the powers held by government. So my criticism isn't really geared towards any particular government or people in power, but more the, I guess, the illegitimate assumption of sovereignty held by the government here in Aotearoa and what the implications of that are. And that's both on an everyday basis, but also through this coronavirus crisis and some of the actions that we saw and the things that were possible because the Crown held so much power. And so I was just going to step us through a number of contrasting images to illustrate some of the things that I've been thinking about during this time. So the first one was this visible use of state power in control of distribution and logistics. And so obviously distribution and logistics was really key for a number of things, including medical care and treatment and PPE and many things. But obviously we witnessed very early on that the borders were closed to people, but were still open to freight. Certain industries could be shut down and are not able to operate, but others are deemed essential to human life and therefore were unable to continue. And of course, there was a huge amount of pressure on those that were required to work in those industries and to complete this essential work. But I think what's interesting is that for a lot of our daily needs, they're really connected into this national infrastructure that reaches out internationally. So there's certain things that we need that we don't produce, for example. And I guess that really points to globalization and the way that our economy is structured. But it showed that we don't really have the ability to be resilient at a smaller scale. So we don't currently tend to provide for all of our needs at a community level or at a city level. And I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, but it really pointed to the way that our society is currently structured. Versus hapū-led distribution and logistics. So this was us at, there's a kai packing shed at Kakao Porawini near the marae there in Whangarei. And this was the highlight of my lockdown because I was allowed to leave the house. But it was quite amazing to see, and I didn't play an important role at all, but it was amazing to see the people, our people, mobilizing and knowing who are our vulnerable people in our communities, who are our kaumātua, how do we get kai from different sources and then redistribute it appropriately in a way that's going to support those that are vulnerable and in need. And it wasn't just Māori in the community, we also extended to Pākehā. And so I thought it was really amazing just to witness, and we saw it all around the country. And something that also struck me is because we have a tension between the iwi hapū thing here in Whangarei, and it was the iwi authorities such as Ngāpuhi, Ngāti Whātua, Ngāti Wai that were the ones that received the funding. But they're really relying on our hapū to be able to actually reach the people, because they don't necessarily have those lists or that community reach. But if you see those pieces working well together, it was actually a really positive iwi hapū relationship thing, because our iwi did work with us to reach those that needed care. And then to supermarkets as a sole source of sustenance, as we saw, it was all chaos, and it was quite a challenging time, and there was a lot of lines, and people were very anxious about shopping. I only shopped once a fortnight. I was very anxious about leaving to go shopping, and I think a lot of people felt that way due to that's the kind of one place where you're exposed when there's risk, versus kai sovereignty and marakai and food production. So I was really fortunate where I'm living, which is actually with my cousin's in-laws on a farm that has like 3 houses and a little studio. So it's kind of like a little papakāinga. They produce a lot of food, and there was many waves of different harvests while we're in lockdown. And I felt, because I had only lived there for a few months, but I'm often at work, I'm often out away from the farm, I really didn't know what we grew there, or was quite disconnected from food sources. And from that time in lockdown, that was probably the best thing, because I actually had this running list of what we grow on the farm, and then I was understanding when things are ready for harvest, and then you've got to make a lot of different things with it, because you've got a huge amount of whatever it is. And I think we've just become very disconnected from our food sources, even those of us that live in areas where we could be very connected.
Take that away if you want.
And the next one was around the visible use of state power and security control. And this was huge. Policing was huge. People, they even, I forget the number, but the hotline to kind of knock on people, that was kind of a big deal, that they needed to set that up, because everyone is calling the police on their neighbours to enforce the rules. Versus our hapū border controls and checkpoints. And, this was quite a contentious thing. And, there was a lot of talk in the media and saying, is this lawful? And eventually the government's, bottom line was, it's fine as long as they work with the police, which is quite alarming, actually, that our hapū are not able to defend their own rohe unless they communicate. So unless they, work together with the police who represent the government. And so, people have a lot of different views on this, but I just thought it was really interesting to see the difference in who has the power and the ability to protect their communities. And then to the economy, there were these very alarming looking graphs coming out regularly, and we're all worried about, is the economy going to tank? Because it's, so related to the market, and, and then the government came through with things like wage subsidies, and then there were cries of, is this socialism? Is this what we want in this country? The talk about economics was very interesting, and I think it's been very interesting in the aftermath, because it obviously hasn't hit all parts of the economy equally, and some are bounding back in different ways. And versus these kainga-based economies and models of interdependence. So I was really interested in this massive rise in like Māori small-scale e-commerce, where Māori business putting forward things for sale by Māori, and we're trying to support local economic development rather than getting products from further away and services from further away. And of course, the kai sovereignty thing is all kind of linked up with this. And then the next thing was around substandard, poorly configured and overcrowded housing. So I think we realized that most of our housing isn't really fit for purpose, not if you're going to be there all the time, and often even if you're just going to be there some of the time. So we all know that our housing stock is really poor in New Zealand. We've got huge issues with mold and damp, and our homes aren't warm, dry and healthy, not to mention some of our remote Māori communities where people live in shacks and cow sheds and tents and shipping containers. So we know all this, and then in the urban areas, people living in overcrowded housing, and the issue we have with homelessness. So we knew all this before, but I think the fact that everyone had to be domiciled at an address and stay there continuously, unless they had these very specific reasons for leaving, really drew attention to the fact that our homes are, one, substandard, but two, not designed to be lived in continuously. And I think a lot of people who are looking after their kids as well as trying to work, as well as not having enough separate spaces and time to do those things, very familiar with that issue.
Expert.
And then versus the kainga as self-contained spaces of home and sustenance. So I haven't talked to the people up at Ōrākei. I don't know how they fared. I suspect probably better. But I think that this emerging model of contemporary papakāinga has at its core this intention that you're able to live and work and, you know, play on site and build strong families and communities, and that most of your needs will be covered in that space. And so it includes your house or your whare, it includes shared communal spaces, it includes, you know, open space. And all of these different pieces are in a kind of a self-contained unit. And then it might also include economic functions. And I don't know that this dream has been fully realized, but I think a lot of people show the kainga tuatahi example because it's a very good one in terms of a built example. And I hope that over the years to come, we'll see a lot more come to fruition and be living examples and not just a concept or a dream. And then the last image is this idea of the landscape of quarantine. So our public spaces were very empty because people weren't traveling to work and so on. And there's some interesting photojournalism projects, but also a lot of people reflecting on the positives. So people out exercising rather than having car-dominated streets. And there's just been a lot of discourse and discussion around our cities and how we plan them, as well as the key kind of need for people to have access to open space and green areas and so on for health and well-being. And we saw some terrible stories overseas where people are confined to apartments and they didn't have access to outdoor space and weren't allowed to leave. And so I think it's really pushed kind of a rethink of our cities, hopefully. And then the contrasting image is really around indigenizing and decolonizing urban space and to reimagine a different spatial future. And Matapōpori Trust in Ōtautahi, I think, are a really shining example of that. A lot of that has come because of earthquake legislation. So again, that thing where who has the power to make laws and who has power of the way resources are distributed. But I also think the amazing work done by the hōkainga practitioners, their artists, designers, planners, technicians is really phenomenal. And they had a unique opportunity with the Christchurch rebuild to do so. And so I'd love to see that across all of our cities, not necessarily in response to a disaster. And I hope that as we enter a flurry of building, of state-sponsored, state-led building to fuel the economic rebuild, that these are things that are of concern. So things like procurement to work with hapū, things like requiring, cultural narratives. And when we also look to things like kāinga ora, who are master planning these large developments, I really hope that they start to take the treaty partnership more seriously and work more closely with hapū. And I'd love to see return of land and control of some of these functions key and at the forefront of thinking as we're looking at these huge programs where the government has a great deal of power, and a lot of them have come out of the fact that we've had this COVID crisis and therefore an economic crisis, and therefore surely this is required and we're going to push through these things with a lot of urgency. So there's kind of scary things and there's kind of opportunities and hope. And so I guess that's all I wanted to say today, was just to draw our attention to some of these contrasting images, and maybe this will feed into some of the other discussion that happens in this space. So kia ora koutou.
Kia ora.
Over to you, Sophie. Sorry, it's you, isn't it? Sorry.
Is it? Yeah, that's right. Kia ora. Thanks, Jade. That's epic.
Add something. I just realized I barely introduced myself because I was thrown by the technology. I just wanted to say I'm from Ngāti Hou and Te Parawhau, and I live here in Whangarei, and that my mahi is in architecture and urban design, but I also do a bit of writing. Okay, that's all. In case that context was not clear.
I think I'd love to open this up to any questions that are out there. Please either use the reactions button to say you want to may have a question, put your hand up for a question, or write a chat, or unmute yourself and say something. But I just wanted to ask you straight away, I'm curious about the challenge to kainga order. Clearly they're in a good position right now to be doing something quite radical. What do you see from what you understand? What there might be any blocks for them to do more of the decolonising work themselves?
Yeah, I really haven't seen the commitment to it, although I'd like to see that. And I think the second piece of legislation that came through was reasonable in terms of uplifting the status of mana whenua. But it's such a monolith, and it's really hard to know what's going on inside. So I don't really know anything more than anybody else, but I've been repetitively asking anyone who I think might know to try and understand what kainga order are doing. And I haven't really heard anything too promising, but let's keep asking those questions.
Great, thanks. Yes. Any questions for Jade right now? Scrolling through the participants. I mean, you really frame it very beautifully. I guess, yeah, that was a great contrast between the issues of the actual containment of the virus and then the way in which we're being fed and nurtured, which is they're all spatial, and I think that's something we need to talk more about. And again, I'm really glad that you've started us off, because it brings conversations from the abstract ideas of politics onto the ground. I think we'll end up with some more conversation with you involved towards the end. But maybe we should move to the next.
Oh, just before I introduce you, Sophie, just to add, Jade, thank you for that korero. I think it was a great summary of all the different aspects of what it means to be in lockdown in this country, and the ways in which whānau and hapū in comparison to iwi, which is a nice to hear that kind of nuanced argument kind of plays itself out. And I guess one of the things that really struck me is that, as you say, there was a sort of sense that, we didn't want to kind of rock the boat just now, because actually we all want to be kind of safe and well and happy, and not kind of full of COVID. But it did strike me that if the processes had been working well beforehand, then government wouldn't have been able to. They would have sort of kept going with those good processes, i.e. sharing in partnership with hapū or iwi, the power. And if you don't have those things in play when the going's good, of course you're not going to be able to do it when the going's bad. So kia ora for that.